to take one's own life. I think in some communities it might be seen as the weakness. Now, it's obviously not. In fact, the weakness might be on the rest of us, not to have noticed it, not to have sort of intervened or said something. There is too much stigma. There shouldn't be any stigma around suicide. Afterward, I started thinking a lot about how to prevent suicide, and I hadn't really thought about it enough before. I think one of the issues is just, if you treat it as a stigma, people just don't talk about it. And one of the key things to do is obviously to get people to talk.
Are you able to take us back to that moment that you found out that Tariq was no longer here?
So at that moment, I was Home Secretary. I was sitting in the back of the car with my wife. My phone rings, and it was my brother. And he had heard first. He said, "Sajid, are you all right?" He said, "It's got something really important to talk to you about. Where are you?" And I told him where I was. And he said, "Well, I don't have to say this." He said, "But Tariq's dead." I said, "Does Mum know?" And he said, "No." But she doesn't.
I want to just kind of ask you a broad question around, what any worries or concerns you have about the world in which young people are going into.
Do I have concerns? Yes, I do. That's why I co-authored what's called the Online Harms White Paper at the time, which eventually turned into a bill and an act, because we had a lot more things that could be harmful, especially to young people. I felt that this was a space, online space, that was pretty unpoliced, and there is absolutely harmful content. And sadly, I met parents as Home Secretary that lost their children to suicide, and there's no doubt that it was the content they'd accessed online.
Do you think we're doing enough now? What more could we be doing?
There's a lot of good things that is going to come from AI, how education, health and stuff like that, but like a lot of technologies, there'll be some things that might not be so good, you need to keep an eye on. And I think the thing that would concern me is there's reliance on the companies that are developing the ways to interact with AI. There's already been examples of where just bad advice has been given.
It's my belief that too many societal problems persist because we keep relying on the same ways of thinking. Question the Default exists to challenge the norms that shape our society, dismantling the status quo and exploring better alternatives for how we live and manage our health and well-being. Question the Default is for those who are driven to create a better future. If this mission resonates with you, please consider subscribing, liking, or sharing. Every single small action helps us on our mission. Thank you. Okay, so Sajid Javid, thank you so much for coming on. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. It's good to be on.
Yeah, brilliant. And thank you so much for finding the time. And I think today we will, of course, talk about the sad loss of your brother, Tariq, to suicide, and also maybe your time in government as well. Of course, there's a personal but also professional kind of head to bring into this too. So like I say, please do feel to jump in between the two as and when you feel comfortable. But how has life been for you post-government, I guess?
Well, it's good. I decided to leave government, I guess, almost like a couple of years before I actually left Parliament. So I had plenty of time to plan for it. And luckily, I had a bit of a career before being in politics as well. So I had something to sort of think about in getting back to. So now I'm back in business. I'm doing a couple other not-for-profit things. I'm chairman of a charity, and I'm helping also to run a commission on community cohesion. So there's plenty of stuff to keep me busy.
Yeah, sure. And I was seeing there's some work at University of Exeter, is that right?
I'm also, just signed up to a bit of work for them to help them with some of fundraising for their research into health and climate change and other issues. So that's my ex-university.
Okay.
And they had approached me, and I just thought it's a good way to give back to an institution, the university that gave me so much.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I'm down from Cornwall, so Cornwall Devon noises. I kind of love hate, but yeah, know it well. But yeah, and I saw some of your work you're doing in kind of looking at some of the root causes of the riots, and I was kind of trying to compare some of the work that we might talk about today. And actually, I do think there's some really interesting synergy to that kind of loss of community, which maybe we'll touch upon. But I guess if I kind of look back over the years, I remember you sharing the story around the loss of Tariq, and it was kind of raw, honest, to the point, and it kind of gripped a huge number of people in the space of suicide bereavement. Are you able to take us back to that moment that you found out that Tariq was no longer here?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to talk about it. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it because I want to help others, right? In to try and prevent something like that happening. It happens far too often, as sadly, about too many others perhaps listening. So at that moment, I was Home Secretary, and obviously I was an MP, but I was also Home Secretary. I'd actually been down to Bristol to see my mother, and I still try to sort of see my mother once a month or something. And I went down from London, and spent some time with her. I was on my way back into London. We were on the A4, so quite close into central London. And I wasn't driving because I was Home Secretary. I had drivers at a government car and protection officers. Basically, they were driving. I was sitting in the back of the car with my wife. My phone rings, and it was my brother, another brother. So I was about to say I have four brothers. I guess I have three brothers now, sadly. And so my brother Bass was calling, and he had heard first, and. And he said, Sajid, are you all right? He said, it's got something really important to talk to you about. Where are you? And I told him where I was. And he said, well, I don't have to say this. He said, but Tariq's dead. And that's how, he put it. I guess there was no other way. And then I sort of said also, I was obviously in total shock. That what do you mean? What do you mean he's dead? At this point, my wife overheard the conversation. Obviously, could see it's something very serious. She couldn't hear the conversation fully, and I think she put her hand on my hand, and she knew obviously some very bad news. And then he said, "Look, Sarge, I can't. Now's not the time to go through. When you get home, to your house in London," he said, "Give me a call. How far are you away from home?" I said, "About 20 minutes." He said, "But," I said, are you sure he's dead?" He said, "Yes." He goes, "I've just seen his body, and I'm with Sylvia, who was my brother's partner at the time, and he's definitely dead." And I said, "What happened?" He said, "It is not good. It's not about I can't. Obviously, it's not good." But he said, "It's not straightforward." He said, "Well, I'll tell you when you get home." And that was it. I even think actually the protection officers sort of heard a bit of that, and they realised something serious had happened. And then I hung up, and my wife said, "What's up?" And I told her Tariq's dead, and she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I don't know. We're going to call Bass when we get home." Oh, and then my brother did say also on the call, I remember this as well. He said, "I said, does Mum know?" And he said, "No." So she doesn't. And he said, "We have to talk about that. Who's going to tell Mum?" And then I said, so I mentioned my other brothers, Khalid and Atif, do they know? He said, "No." He said, "I called you first, but I'm going to call them now. But we have to work out who and how we're going to tell Mum." Because my mum lives alone, and she was living alone then because my father passed away, in 2012 from cancer. So she was living alone. So we were a bit worried about how we're going to tell her.
Thank you for sharing that. I know it's not easiest thing to kind of relive in many ways, but how did you personally, maybe at that point you were obviously a high-ranking government minister at the time, how did you come to terms with going back into work with that news?
Well, I mean, of course it was hard, but in a way, because I was so busy as Home Secretary, in a way I sort of, you could, if you wanted to, just absorb yourself in the work, of course. So, in immediately receiving the news, that day and in the coming days, I think the next day I went back down to Bristol to be with my mum. And, but then I was back up in Parliament, and I hadn't said anything publicly at all about it. I don't think it was public information. But I also knew that given my public profile, that at some point very quickly the news would be out. And it was. It was in the Daily Mail and other papers, not in some negative way. I mean, it's news, right? And it was put out. And so it just meant a lot of people knew without me telling them. But for the first, before it had come out, I was in Parliament and in my department. And, the Home Office is a pretty busy department. And so I think partly, I think I reacted by just absorbing myself in my work.
This is a kind of distraction you had to be on. There was no kind of letting up on that part. And how, for your brothers and your mum, how did you come to terms with that in the week and months that followed, Tariq, Steph?
Well, I was in terms of my immediate sort of concerns. It's around my mum. Tariq had or has 2 children, adult children.
Okay.
And so I was thinking about them. But the first thing I wanted to make sure my mum had, obviously when she heard the news, but she was coping with it well. It was her, Tariq obviously is my eldest brother, so it's her firstborn son, and and she's close to all her sons, and then also about how it happened. Obviously as people know, Tariq took his own life, and it was in a hotel room. He was on his own, and because it was in the press and so it was public, and then eventually there was a coroner's report. It's all quite sort of public now, but at the time I knew that, and it wasn't so public. And with my brothers, we first thought, should we tell mum, like what actually, some of the detail? And we decided we should, because she'd hear it anyway, and it's better that we've told her, and she sort of not come to terms with it, of course, but sort of absorbed it from her sons. But one thing I also remember is one of my mother's early reactions was she said, "Can we not tell anyone it was suicide?" She said, "Can we just not say it's suicide? Can we just say it was a heart attack or something?" And I remember that conversation with her in the first week, and I said, "No, Mum, we can't do that." And it's hard in a way, because obviously she's your mum and she's in so much pain and she's asking you for something. But I thought, no, I said, we can't do that. I said, because it's not right. It is what it is. And we mustn't be like shameful about it. I mean, obviously any death is tragic for any reason in a family. And I think that was, for her, that way that was coming. There's a lot of stigma, especially I think it's fair to say in Asian communities. My parents are originally from Pakistan, and I think it's fair to in sort of certainly Pakistani communities in general, that it would, there's a lot of stigma around suicide. And I thought, well, we can't do this. And all my brothers agreed, by the way, with me. And so we all, and that helped. We were all very clear with Mum in a nice way that we've got to be honest, and you shouldn't say to anyone that it was a heart attack or something like that. And actually, she resisted it at first, but only for a few days, and then eventually accepted it. And today, if you speak to my mum, she said it was the right thing to do. We handled it well. But at the time, it was a bit different. And, I thought I'd mention that because there is too much stigma. There shouldn't be any stigma around suicide, because this is part of the challenge, I think, about people that I felt afterwards, and maybe we get into it. I started thinking a lot about how to prevent suicide, and just I hadn't really thought about it enough before. I think one of the issues is just if you treat it as a stigma, people just don't talk about it, and one of the key things to do is obviously to get people to talk.
I appreciate you sharing that kind of personal connection with your mum. But actually, I think it's very common to hear that actually when someone dies by suicide, that we actually don't want to share the actual cause of death. And again, with multiple reasons why that might be. You touched upon perhaps from a cultural, religious perspective. What do you think it might be driving some of that kind of taboo in your kind of family background, let's say?
I think there's a religious aspect.
Yeah.
My family are Muslims, and in Islam, that depending on one's interpretation, some people would say that it says it's for someone to kill themselves is anti-Islamic.
Okay.
I think that's part of it. I think that also outside of religion, I think in many, I don't know if that's the right word, but many sort of more traditional societies, if I put it that way. I think about where my parents came from, the villages, the kind of parents that the school came. My mum, in the day she was brought up, she never went to school. There was no education for girls. Okay. Boys went to school, girls didn't. So I think all that has an impact, and I think part of it was sort of it's a weakness of a family. Someone has a heart attack, you could say, obviously, it's just something that just happens to people, sadly, and that's how many millions of people die. But to take one's own life, I think in some communities it might be seen as it's a weakness. Now, it's obviously not, right? In fact, the weakness might be on the rest of us, not to have noticed it, not to have sort of intervened or said something. But I think that's where it comes. And I don't think it's unique to any particular community. I think it's probably more widespread than people realize.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a really nice way you put it around this kind of the actual weaknesses, perhaps on those around us. The person who dies by suicide, not the person who actually takes their own life. And it's really interesting kind of framing and flipping on its head. But thank you for sharing that. But also glad that your mum now actually sees the benefit in what you and your brothers did by actually telling the complete truth to actually longer term protect her from the realities of actually not keeping it in and not kind of pretending it was something different. And if I'm sure you'll be very well aware, those who do lose someone to suicide are at greater risk, and part of that is how we then communicate it within families and those impacted by suicide. And it's predicted that for every single suicide, 135 people are then directly impacted by suicide. So it's really serious numbers. In the aftermath, you said that you kind of asked yourself, could you have made a difference in part of my research? And how have you dealt with those kind of feelings over time?
Yeah, I mean, I did. And, obviously I thought about it a lot. And especially around, obviously there might be events, moments, family get-togethers when, I thought about Tariq, and obviously he's not there anymore, his birthdays and things like that. And then I thought, like, could I have, if I'd known that he was feeling like this, is there more that I could have done? And the truth, there probably is. I didn't know, but should I have known? And why didn't I know? I mean, I can mention lots of reasons, but I think partly I was just very busy. But we all are very busy, and lots of people. It wasn't just because I'm Home Secretary. You can have any job and still be lots of busy in your life. So, looking back, I think that, one thing certainly that would have helped is if I'd spent more time with him. Just, it doesn't have to be physically, you have to be there, and that can be tough. But, on the phone or whatever, even text messaging and things, and just making sure that someone knows that you're there and you're available. And afterwards, learning a lot more about suicide and thinking more about prevention. One of the things that comes across time and time again is to get people to talk and open up, especially men. Suicide is, I think, men are 3 times more likely.
That's right.
As I understand it, to take their own lives. I think that something like, I think it's the biggest killer of men under the age of 50. Yes, it is the biggest killer. Right, so it's a health emergency, right? And when I was health secretary, especially, I decided the government should do more, and we should have a national sort of suicide prevention plan. It should be cross-government. We should be thinking a lot more about this, not just what good charities can do, what people can do, what parents can do, brothers and sisters can do, what government can do. I also, realize really that one of the key things is, I mean, there's lots of things that can be done, but one of the key is to talk to people and reach out. And so I think, I hope I'm right in saying that today, like with my friends, not just family, with friends especially as well, I think I try even harder to reach out, how they're doing. Like one thing, might sound a bit silly, something, but I quite often send texts to friends I haven't talked to for ages. I don't even know what they're quite up to now, whatever. And I just send them a text, say, hey, it's Sajid here, just checking in, how you doing? And that's what I say. And sometimes it's remarkable what response you get, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of my friends think, wow, I thought you'd be too busy for this. But it's okay. You don't have to talk. So, and I think just people knowing that someone's checking in on them, even if you just got to say it, like, I'm just checking in, is one of my favorite texts to send to people. So I'm just checking in. And I don't think anyone thinks it's a negative. And I just think, and why am I doing that? Because of the sad experience with my brother.
This episode is brought to you in support of Calm, the campaign against living miserably. Calm is a leading UK suicide prevention charity on a mission to help people end their misery, not their lives. We both do things differently. We both know we need to change the conversation around suicide, and that's why together we're both creating space to question the defaults that shape the way we think, feel, and talk about suicide and mental health. We're opening up conversations that remind people, whatever you are facing, you're not alone. Calm has loads of tools and resources available to anyone online to help you find the support that you need, including a life-saving helpline for people open every day from 5 p.m. to midnight, as well as vital online resources for anyone who needs them. So if you or someone you know needs to talk, please visit thecalmzone.net. Thank you for being part of this. And of course, today we may touch on conversations about suicide in this episode. Together, we can question the defaults that keep people silent, smash the stigma around suicide, and help build a world where no one has to face it alone. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you doing that. And before losing Tariq, would that sort of check in with friends? Does it change your dynamic in your friendship groups too, in and out of work too?
Yes, it has.
And I think there's there's a lot to be said about that. And I only asked that question around that. Could you make a difference? Because that is a very common feeling for those that have been left behind. And I think it's very important for us to be able to, to acknowledge that is a feeling in itself, and it is very common within those who are left behind. But also there are limits, because like you said, people are busy. There are, whether you're health secretary or not, that's not the point. It's more that we have lives, we are preoccupied. Is how do we then be intentional about the time around asking those sorts of questions? And I think I try to do that on the way home. It tends to be when I'm kind of, my energy has just gone out of my brain, and I have that kind of time of almost like numbness. You know what? I'm just going to then communicate out to people. You mentioned then around your time, in government, and actually, this is a health emergency. You said that. How did your losing Tariq impact you, especially in the role of a health secretary? And do you think we're doing enough now? What more could we be doing?
It impacted me a lot, and so as I mentioned, I was Home Secretary at the time, then I became Chancellor, then I left government for a bit. But I thought particularly when I was Health Secretary, because there's, I think in trying to combat and reduce the rate of suicide, it's a cross-government job. It's not just for one department, but I think it begins with the health department, because it's a killer, right? And one could describe it, maybe it's a mental health challenge, maybe it's another health problem that people think they can't get out of and things. So I think it starts with the health department. And when I arrived at the health department, clearly my sort of priority obviously was COVID. I became health secretary in the middle of COVID, and of course that was my priority. But there were one or two other things I really cared about, and this was one of them. And I asked immediately with my officials, I said, I want to publish a completely new, modern national suicide strategy. I want to do a consultation on it. I want to speak to the people that have been thinking about this a lot longer than I have or any of you have. I met a number of charities and groups, well-established ones like Samaritans, smaller ones like Papyrus and others, Shout and things. And I said, I want to look at technology. I want to sort of look at social media, and there's nothing left behind. So that was one thing, just a completely new approach, leaving nothing behind. The second thing was I said that it has to be cross-government, right? So it's not just for the health department. So we have to think about what role is there in preventing suicide for the Department of Work for Pensions, right? People are out of work. They might feel destitute, unlucky, and things, and they could be maybe thinking more. Maybe they're thinking more in a dark place. Similar with MOJ and prisoners and rehabilitation of prisoners, Department of Education, young people, and so it was properly. I think the first time done properly cross government. I wanted to allocate a bit more money to it, because I thought with some of the charities I met, that even like a $50,000 or $75,000, that could be leveraged so well by a charity and bring out so many more volunteers by supporting them, that you could touch more people. So that was one thing I got myself very much into. I also talked about it. We're talking about it today, obviously quite openly, but when I was in government, I thought if I talk about it, I want to remove this taboo, this stigma, and I want people to realize that actually it's such a big killer, right? And there's so much more that could be done. And suicide rates, sadly, they have been going up. But if I look at some other countries, they do seem to be lower. And so, we can maybe do more. So that's how I try to sort of make more of an impact myself.
No, thank you for that. And I guess you have witnessed what many people would never witness the inner workings of government from multiple departments. And I guess when you're comparing country suicide rates, then I'm there thinking around the role of community, some of your current work, but then also your previous life in looking at the NHS. So do you think we are doing enough when we consider the NHS and communities, and then our aim, which is to reduce suicide?
I think your question was, are we doing enough? I think we can always do more. I think if you ask me, do I think governments are taking it more seriously than perhaps a few years ago? I do. Right? And I'm not just saying that with the government that I was part of, but even with the current government and things, I think it is, because obviously, combating suicide is not a party political thing and things. You get any decent politician together, from any political persuasion, they all agree on how important this is, and I do think it's, compared to perhaps to what it was like in the past, I think it is being taken more seriously. But do I think at the same time, if you said to me, look, do I think more can be done? Of course, more can be done. More can be done. I think it's not all about money, right? So I still think that government departments, cooperating with each other, they can leverage that whole government machine much more, right? I also think, for example, local government, which so many of us, when we sort of interact with government or government services, a lot of it is local government as well. I think that can be brought more into play. And I think just of general awareness in the, when I used to say to MP friends, I made a number of speeches in Parliament. Even when I left as health secretary, I did an event with, not an event, I got together with the Samaritans, who I think do amazing work. And I said to them that, one thing we should do is educate all MPs about suicide and suicide prevention and what they can do vis-a-vis their constituents. Because often, people, and I had this as a constituency MP, people will go and see their MP when they're in a very bad place. And I thought we should train MPs and their staff to spot some signs. And if they were, then they could know how to direct them and how to handle them, what to say, what not to say. And so with the Samaritans, we put together a training program for MPs. And I was in Speaker's House with the Speaker of Parliament, Lindsay Hoyle, who sadly, has also been touched by suicide in his family and deeply cares. And I approached him and he said, "Yep, Sajid, let's do this. Let's do it together." And we started training MPs and their staff. And I don't know how that's sort of the ultimate impact that had. I don't know, right? Because it's hard to determine impact and things like that. But I hope it helped. If there's just one MP that saw something, or their staff member, and they directed that person to the right support and help, and they didn't kill themselves, it's all been worth it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant initiative. And so I guess if you were Health Secretary now, and we're seeing the world, it's predicted an unemployment rate is going to get to 5% early next year. I was reading in City AM last week. I think there's almost like an elephant in the room that we never talk about when it comes to suicide, which there is almost going to be this inevitable rise in unemployment rates, and perhaps not this transferable nature of skills that it used to be into other jobs, because the jobs are not going to be there, at least in the short-term squeeze. I can't help but think that we are leaning into a greater health emergency when it comes to mental health and suicide, purely as a result of the mass unemployment. And I guess if you were, in government now, do you think conversations are happening to that degree? Or is it more, actually, we need to look at the economic impact and get more people into job, but actually, what do we do to protect people in this very short-term hit of actually a lack of meaning, lack of purpose, most likely still going to have their own childcare costs, they're going to have mortgage, rent. I feel like we're sleepwalking into a disaster.
I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be that pessimistic.
Okay.
Why? Because I think, first of all, who knows where unemployment's going to be? I agree with you, of course, it's heading in the wrong direction. But 5% is not 10%. And what do I mean by that? There's countries in Europe, our neighbors, that have far, far higher unemployment, some even higher than 10%, especially youth unemployment. Right? Some countries in Europe have 30, 40% youth unemployment. And so what I mean by that, of course, we want to do better always, but it's not, when you look at those countries with high unemployment rates, they don't necessarily have higher suicide rates than the UK. So I'm not, personally, I wouldn't be so convinced that there's that direct link, right? That said, right, I think that clearly having more opportunities for employment, gainful employment and things is a good thing, whether it's trying to combat suicide prevention or general mental health or just general good health is a good thing. And I found, especially during my time in government, that there's no quick fix to that. There's no lever in any department that says more jobs, right? So you have to work at many different things at the same time to have a growing economy and stuff. And then we'll have to get into economics and taxes and stuff. And I guess we want to avoid that. But the thing is, there's a lot of things that governments should be doing or could be doing to try and get economic growth going and therefore more jobs. And that is just good all round, right? Not for just the super important thing that we're talking about. I think it's just good all round, right? Like there's a lot of people that might not be suicidal. Of course, there's plenty. There's people that might have poor mental health, might have mental health challenges, right? They and there's a spectrum, right? And I think that you want early intervention, and as much as possible, so that someone who does have some, let's call them challenging thoughts at the early stage, they don't develop into something much darker, right? And so, and part of that is jobs and opportunities, but part of it also is having the right sort of mechanisms in place to spot it. And that there's only so much also government can do, right? I'm also just a believer there's a lot of great things that government can do, but government also just can't do everything. And sometimes it can just mess it up, right? So when it comes to this important area, I think you'll get a lot more out of it if the only thing, not the only thing, but if one of the most important things government did was to make sure people just realized how important it is to get people to talk and some of the telltale signs of someone that may be having suicidal thought, right? Especially amongst men, only because they're just much less reluctant to talk and open up. Right?
Absolutely.
And there's lots of good, like, if you look at, you might be working out as a construction worker, you might be a plumber, you might be an accountant, whatever your walk of life, whatever you're doing, if there are ways that employers, for example, and say, guys, let's get together. You know what? It's okay to talk to each other. Don't be shy or ashamed about opening up about your emotions or family life. It's not like, some people say, I've heard people say, for example, oh, it's girly. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? It's not. You should be talking about yourself and your family and things with your friends. But people can do that. You don't need government.
It's a really interesting point. So what do you think the limits are from government's perspective on this topic?
Well, the limits are for government. There's only so much money the government can spend on things. If you said to me, look, Sajid, if the government gave another 10, 20 million pounds to suicide prevention charities, would it help? Of course it would help. But then you could say, what about another 20? What about another 20? So there's only so much government could do, especially when there's so many competing demands on government. So when I was health secretary, I was also working on like a 10-year cancer plan, right? I was working on a 10-year dementia plan, right? I was trying to deal with COVID. All of these things also cost money, right? So you've got to have a sense of priorities and get a balance in all the things you're trying to tackle. So that's a limit. That's a natural limit on government. And the other limit is that on things like you're trying to get more people to talk about their feelings and things like that. Obviously, there's not, government can say what it wants, that everyone should talk and this and that. But I think it's probably better done by non-government actors. So that's why I think the charities would be, just generally because they're not politicians, they're not ministers and stuff. I just think they'll be a bit more trusted.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I was just going to go on to ask you this anyway. Let's take some of this stop smoking points that obviously everyone would always cite and how government intervenes. Do you think it's not the role of government when it comes to suicide on those sorts of mass campaigns, those huge awareness driving, changing the culture and narrative on those topics doesn't necessarily apply to suicide? And actually, it's probably far greater for that to be done by one of the leading charities, like you mentioned, perhaps Papyrus or Carl.
I think charities in general, but there are some in particular just well established, so well known, therefore, that will be very trusted, because I think people generally know that it's just, they're not political. There's no other hidden agendas. These are just good people that have come together to try and prevent suicide of anyone, right? They don't get young, old, male, female. They just want to prevent suicide. And there's lots of these, not lots, but there are a few charities that are very good at this. I mentioned Samaritans earlier. I know a bit more about them just because I worked with them on a few initiatives. I also ran the London Marathon this year and raised all the funding went to Samaritans.
Would you do it
again? Now I keep helping them. Yeah, nice. Because I want to keep trying to do things. That's why I'm chatting with you today. Right? I might not be in politics anymore, but there's also ways that I think if everyone just did a little bit, it made a huge difference.
How was your mental health during that? Because obviously, you've lost your brother. You're going through perhaps arguably the most challenging time to be in government, and obviously a very talked about government. How on earth did you manage your own well-being through all of that?
Look, we're all different, and I think in my case, if you think about this, I thought about how I was helped, as you say, my own sort of mental well-being. In my particular case, and obviously we're all different, I think that my family was a good bedrock. My wife, in particular, we're very close, and and I think that all that helps. I didn't have obviously I had a lot of work going on as I think as Home Secretary. Then I was trying to deal with Brexit and Novichok attack on in Salisbury and stuff. Everything was going on, terrorists and stuff. But also, I think friends and family was a big part of it. But also, just going back to what we discussed earlier, I think maybe just that thing, just being busy. I felt that as Home Secretary, there's so many different other things going on that I just didn't have time, like maybe some spare time, just to sort of dwell on things, and maybe that would affect my mental health. I don't know, but just maybe family and being busy.
Yeah. No, thank you. I know you've got a passion around the online space, and about you did some work around trying to make that safer for young people. I want to just kind of ask you a broad question around what any worries or concerns you have about the world in which young people are going into, and then I guess your perspective on AI and technology when it comes to mental health, self-harm, and suicide.
Yeah. So first of all, just in general, and then I'll turn to your AI point, is that your question: do I have concerns? Yes, I do. Right? That's why I co-authored what's called the Online Harms White Paper at the time, which eventually turned into a bill and an act. And of course, that wasn't just about sort of suicide material and things. It's about a lot more things that could be harmful, especially to young people. And I thought broadly, it's the right way for a government to react, in that because young people especially deserve your protection from adults, right? And it's the adults that are making the laws and voting on the laws and stuff. And I think that just as we protect young people rightly, especially children, in so many ways, so many laws that are there to protect children. I felt that this was a space, online space, that was pretty unpoliced, and there is absolutely harmful content, and sadly, I met parents as Home Secretary, especially that lost their children to suicide, and there's no doubt that it was through content they'd accessed online, and there's no foolproof way to deal with such content. But I think it does make sense to try and have a sort of balanced, proportionate approach to that. And sometimes, people say, oh yeah, if you do that, young people will be able to access it in any way. But you know what? If only 10% can, when before 100% can, you still achieve something worthwhile. You also asked me about with AI content. Look, there's a lot of good things that is going to come from AI, from how education, health, and stuff like that. But they're like a lot of technologies. There'll be some things that might not be so good. You need to keep an eye on. And I think the thing that would concern me is probably in this space, like the AI chatbots and things. So already there's so many AI sort of apps around and things, and young people, obviously anyone can access them and just feel like sometimes maybe think they're having a conversation with something that's intelligent or sentient in some way, and clearly it's not. And there's no real sort of, I feel there's no real oversight of that. There's reliance on the companies that are developing these sort of ways to interact with AI. But there's already been examples of where some really bad advice, not necessarily related to suicide, but just bad advice has been given to people, and that worries me, like which way that goes, because there's a lack of sort of a global, not global regulation, but I think there's so much competition for countries to, I guess, to try and sort of, from their perspective, try and get ahead in AI, that I think that there's some blind eye being turned to some of the potential long-term challenges, and I think this is one of them.
Yeah, definitely. That kind of perhaps the race is actually kind of being number one priority, and actually perhaps we're missing some very basic safeguarding principles. That's an interesting question. Is that the government's responsibility to then intervene at that point?
I think there's a role for government, of course. The difficulty with tech and especially AI is that it does require some kind, not every country in the world and stuff, but you definitely need the US to be part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Just given how much of the tech companies are from the US and maybe some other European countries. So the short answer is yes, the government should be looking at that, but it's not easy because you need cooperation. Otherwise, it won't work.
So it would require engagement with the US government essentially to mandate to the US tech firms, which, not putting words in your mouth, is not going to happen. Or do you think it's possible?
It'll be tough.
Yeah, it'll be tough. But you did mention there's some of the good things that you think that AI will perhaps show. Yeah. What are your hopes, I guess, with AI? Broad, but we'd love to hear like your blue sky thinking.
I mean, broadly, like for example, I think some of the best things that will come out of AI is in healthcare. Everything from drug discovery to medical care for people, including prevention. And by the way, I would add mental health to that, right? So, a moment ago, we were talking about AI bots that can give people the wrong advice. But I also believe done properly, might not be today, but probably not long from now, you could have AI bots that could give people very good advice. Mm. And if that makes it more prevalent and easier for people to access mental health, like talking therapy or other types of therapy, even if it's with a bot, but it's good advice and it's done well, then that's a good thing.
And I'm asking you to make quite a few gut assumptions here, but I think we talk often around the kind of waiting times when it comes to, let's say, neurodivergent conditions. I think it's like a 10-year assumed waiting time. Do you think it could get to a place where it could help with the diagnosis process?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It already is. I mean, there's already many examples where AI is helping with diagnosis, speeding it up, making it less costly. Also, AI, examples where AI is able to spot things. I was just the other day, I was chatting to a radiographer. And she was telling me how AI is already being used to spot things in scans, everything from X-rays to MRIs and things that human eye would just miss. Right? And so in the field of healthcare, but including mental health care, not just physical, I think done properly, AI can make a massive difference.
And I think I was reading a report the other day as well around, I think it was radiography as well, and actually there was this assumed kind of job loss that would come, but actually it went the other way because they had to get through such a mass of scans that actually they needed more people to then do the final kind of assessments and kind of run through of what came out of it. But in terms of, I guess, your time in government when it comes to COVID, do you think that actually as a society we've done enough to understand some of the mental health implications coming out of that period where actually at the time, you and the government had to just focus on keeping people safe in this momentary time of crisis? Do you think we've done enough to understand the real impact on, especially those young people who perhaps were displaced from their school systems or missed opportunities as a result?
Have we done enough? Probably not. Mm-hmm. There's still work going on.
Yeah.
There's the COVID work of the COVID inquiry, for example, and others. When you look back to that period, of course, there are lessons to learn from it. But it does remind me that part of governing is to choose and make decisions, and there's always trade-offs, right? So, whether it's COVID or other things from the past, it's much easier to look back in hindsight and say maybe we should have done this, shouldn't have done that. But back then, especially before you had a vaccine. Obviously, the vaccine, thank God, came quickly, relatively. That before you had a vaccine and before people knew just how harmful COVID was, I think politicians, whether it's in the UK or abroad, only had so much information to go on. Right. And a lot of that meant, especially, obviously, we saw it in the UK, we saw it in much of Europe, people staying at home, schools being closed. And there's a negative impact to that as well. Of course there is, right? But your question was, have we done enough to ascertain the damage that might have happened from that? I don't think we have, but that is not the same thing as necessarily saying it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Right? Because to make that determination, you need to, as well as look at the damage, you need to look at the benefit.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And okay, I guess the ones as you can share, the biggest learnings, and in hindsight, you mentioned a few times, what were those from you as you mentioned that? What comes to mind?
I think that some of them were around being more self-sufficient on vaccines, both vaccine creation and manufacturing, both sort of like the development and manufacturing. And also related sort of materials like treatments and PPE and things like that. I think another learning was our hospitals just don't have enough capacity, as in terms of, you just measure it crudely in terms of beds or number of respirators or things like that. We just don't have enough capacity. And it was that fear of hospitals basically collapsing because of demand during COVID that led to much of the lockdowns and all that kind of stuff, which then also had the knock-on effects that you were talking about. So there's a capacity issue. And then I also think there's lessons to be learned about early warning systems. If there will be another pandemic, and it will happen in our lifetime, I'm sure of that. I just don't know when it's going to happen. It may be worse or better in some ways than the last one, relatively speaking, but it will happen. And I think the pandemics are going to happen a lot more frequently than the world has got used to. But the more the earlier warning you have of that, and there are ways to have early warning on these things. I think that is a lesson as well.
And we're ready for the next when that happens.
No, not necessarily. No.
And that worries.
I'm not saying we're not or we are, but I think that if you said to me, "Have we learned, like collectively, have we learned all the lessons?" No, we haven't. Of course not.
But that, we have to be always on the watch out now for those early warning signs. That's an interesting point. You still have that kind of passion and drive about you. Would you ever return to government, to politics?
Good question. No, that's not my plan.
That's plain and simple.
No, I'm happy. I had it was 14 years, and I was very blessed with the opportunities I had. I tried my best, but it felt like it was the right time to move on.
Okay, so we have a set of recurring questions kind of coming towards the end now, and you can, choose to not answer these. You can choose to kind of answer them short, sweet, however you'd like to. But I guess what's one default way of thinking or a rule in society that you'd completely erase or get rid of if you could?
Wearing ties.
It's the most light-hearted response I think we've had on that wearing ties. I mean, you have. That used to be. Did you used to always wear a tie every day in government?
Always.
Yeah. So
the last 2 years, I've worn a tie like 4 times.
Is that
maybe 3?
That in itself is worth not going back for. Okay. Okay. What's one belief you used to hold about mental health that you've since let go of yourself?
I used to think it only really affects a very small minority of people. This before I was in politics and things. Like I don't have a number, but I would think maybe it's like 3 or 4% of people type of thing, like a really small minority of people. When obviously the reality is that I think most people at some time in their lives will have some kind of mental health issue.
Yeah. Would you say that's and again, I'm not asking you to talk to every single talk on behalf of every single MP. Do you think that that mental health is now seen as almost like broad brush acceptance that actually this is something that impacts a large number of people across government, or do you still see those pockets of like resistance? Let's say.
Yeah, no. I think it's broad acceptance. There were a lot of changes in the last decade through Parliament and things, and one of those was, for example, in the NHS recognizing that mental health is as serious as physical health and putting it on par, into both legally and otherwise and things. And I think there's broadly there's been a big sort of shift in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, obviously, there's a lot of conversation now around almost inevitable change of government that will happen. Do you think that could be a good thing from mental health point of view?
No, I don't think it makes much difference.
As we are, because of the broad kind of acceptance on the
topic. Broad acceptance, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, and we ask every single guest who comes on the show to share a personal moment. Of course, you have shared a lot today, but I guess what's something you've never or rarely shared publicly, but perhaps we're ready to now?
Well, as you say, I hope I have shared it out. I'll tell you what. It's not. It's not a cop out, but it's a lot more than one moment. I've written a childhood memoir. It's being published in February next year, and in that book, and it's not political. It's just about my life before I even became a politician, and it's called The Colour of Home. As I say, it's been published in February, and I think if you wait for that, your listeners wait for that, I think they will discover a lot about me that they probably didn't know. I'm pretty sure they didn't know.
That's amazing. So can you remind me again, sorry, when that comes out? Because I will make sure.
February the 4th, next year.
February the 4th.
Yes.
Do you know that is it's Time to Talk Day, the 4th or the 6th? I don't know if you knew that, but it's a mental health awareness day around that moment. Right. Amazing. And then
I do talk about mental health and suicide prevention.
Oh, brilliant. Well, just I guess one final question before I let you go. So if we were to consider the world we're in and the world we're going into, if we were to record this in 2035, what do you hope we're talking about? Or perhaps what do you worry we could be talking about?
I'd worry about something we touched on earlier, that AI has sort of gone in the wrong direction, so to speak, for society. And and that could cause therefore a lot of issues, not just on mental health stuff, but much broader. But equally, and this is really hard to predict regarding it's to do with AI again, that AI has, as this new technology, has done wonders for people's healthcare, education, opportunities. It's solved climate change. It's made energy, zero carbon and limitless and things. So, and all of that is possible as well. So that's what I hope for.
Well, I think on that note, that's a good point to wrap up. But I just want to say a huge thank you. And I didn't say at the beginning of the episode, but when I did reach out to you, you took a good amount of time to read my story, consider everything that I shared, and you took very considerable amount of time to actually write to me in a way that I thought was incredibly touching and moving. So I just appreciate you finding the time to even find this gap today, but also to write in the way that you did. That will definitely always.
Look, first, thank you for saying that, but also just thank you for for doing what you're doing, and not just like today stuff, but the work you've been doing in this, and ultimately what that does to help so many other people.
Thank you.
So thank you.
I appreciate that. And today was always going to be personal story, but then a bit into the government where I was always going to be that case. So it was,
of course, that's absolutely fine.
But I appreciate kind of everything that you have done to share, kind of, you know, your lived experience and your family's lived experience of losing a loved one. And I know that will help many, like exactly like it did when you opened up in Parliament, and all the things you did at that point. But also, you know, very clear that you will not be returning to politics, and actually happier about the tie. And just thank you for sharing what you did today. And hope to stay in touch and have a good rest of your evening. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.